Very much, always a pleasure to be here. If you allow me, and it's very hard to speak after two excellent speakers, but if you allow me, I just want to take Juren's quote from Sun Tzu, because I'm a big fan of, and I teach some of his, or his main work, The Art of War. The issue is that when you have tactics without a strategy, he called this the noise before defeat. So I'm really worried about the collision now. The other thing is what Dr. Azdeen mentioned about the Tunisian foreign fighters. If you track the data sets from Afghanistan and Algeria, you would find significant number of Tunisian foreign fighters who were produced under Ben Ali's regime. And more importantly, they were called by their comrades the most extreme. So we're talking about ex-GF defectors who are saying the most extreme were from came from Tunisia at that point, and the same thing with many of the Afghan Arabs. So the phenomenon is not new. The media focus on it is new, mainly at that point because they did not target the West. They were targeting either an Algerian ruling regime or the Soviets in Afghanistan. So it was a different story then. But on my contribution to the changing nature of war, I'm doing this book on how ISIS fights, and I'm trying to understand how did an insurgency, well, we can call it really an insurgency in the end, with limited capacities, limited numbers, attempted to last for that long. And it shouldn't. You know, if you looked at the insurgency literature, really everything that is there in the literature tells you that it shouldn't have lasted that long. And in an attempt to explain why, I was trying to analyze, the airstrikes against them and how successful, basically evaluate the airstrikes. So I was using an old friend/mentor who was a general of air defense, and basically I'm providing the data and he's looking at it, and after a long discussion, he looked at me and he said, because he used to serve in the 80s and the 90s, and he looked at me and he said, the war has really changed. And actually, I took his quote and analyzed some of our paradigms, academic paradigms, to understand war. And really, our understanding of war has really changed in many ways. One of the most influential paradigms that influenced both academics, military generals, and politicians alike was the realist paradigm. And if you looked at the realist paradigm today, the way it understands conflict, the way it tells you that what happens between states matter, what happens within state does not really matter that much, it's just noise in the background, that anarchy is actually between states. So if one state A attacked state B, there's no 911 to call. But if within the state there is hierarchy, there is no anarchy, and you can always call 911. If you looked at all these premises today, they are looked at Syria or at Libya or elsewhere, they're quite obsolete in many ways, and somehow interstate conflicts developed non-violent conflict resolution mechanism. We see that because there is a significant decline since the Cold War of interstate wars, but a significant rise in intrastate civil wars of many sorts. So our understanding of conflict and analyzing it has significantly changed as well. Because of the rise of the intrastate wars, you have a market for non-state armed actors. And this is where things get even more interesting. If you looked at the data sets that we have, you would find pre-1967, so the last quarter of the 20th century basically, the capacities of state armed actors, military units, intelligence, police, and so on, of defeating non-state actors was quite high. If you looked at from the early 19th century, it was about 90%. It became so in every 10 conflicts, 9 of them the state would win against non-state actors, and then it kept declining from probably the half of the 19th century until you would find a significant rise from the last quarter of the 20th century. And if you took the data set from now, we were looking at around 300 insurgencies. You would see that from 1967, the state only won in about quarter, so 25% success rate, meaning military winning or military defeat of the other. The rest, this does not mean that 75% of insurgents win. It means that the state has to either compromise, find a political solution, or get defeated in some cases. And the explanations also are quite many. So You have the scholars who would focus on geographical factors, the geography, the high mountains, the Cuba, Afghanistan, Chechnya, how the geography was used to make out for the military component. Some would focus more on the popular support and the insurgents' popularities in many ways. In the end, Fidel Castro moved from Santiago to Havana, hundreds of miles without a fire shot at him. So the popular support for the insurgents. Some would look at the external support, a state sponsoring the insurgents. Some would look at the military innovation and the military capacities and the breaking of the monopoly of the state over the military sciences, if you wish, and military arts. And this is where I'm focusing more and more on in the case of IS in particular, and Fatima mentioned the IEDs. The IEDs, basically the capacity to manufacture IEDs and use them on multiple levels to serve urban terrorism, to serve guerrilla warfare strategies, and to serve conventional strategies. They're being used as very, if you looked at the vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices and the suicide vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, very useful in terms of making up for lack of artillery, lack of guided missiles, and elsewhere. So used in a conventional way. So what does that mean for this is my third point, and before the last, it's the implication for the state armed actors. Well, the implications is that the nature of warfare has changed quite significantly. You're less and less interested in the 20th century conventional warfare capacities, armored artillery, and so on, and more interested in developing the capacities of UCAVs, the drones between quotations, GTACs, the joint terminal attack controllers that directs the drones in many ways and make it more and more accurate. More interested in intelligence support to the military, and more interested in special forces capacities in terms of surgical strikes and small units that in many ways fight like guerrillas, but with enhanced capacities and with air support. But also more and more interested in looking at non-state partners in the ground, non-state armed partners in the ground. So you're looking at a counter-guerrilla force or a force that is a loyalist guerrilla or a loyalist militia, and developing that forces. And one of the very cynical way to put them in the Middle East came from a colleague who said, rather than boots on the ground, sandals on the ground, between quotations. So this has been actually developing, and we see it obviously in Syria, in Libya, Iraq, and Lebanon, Yemen, elsewhere. Quite a critical matter also that has to do with the political implications of all this. You have the two opposing approaches. The approach that tells you to control this intrastate armed conflicts, you would need the strong man that would be basically disregards human rights, disregards any form of democratization, any form of freedoms, and crack down hard on non-state actors and non-state challenges. And then you have the other approach that would tells you, the opposite. We need to invest more in reconciliation, in de-escalation, and therefore in demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, and this will keep the stability. Obviously, probably since the election of President Trump, the first school is winning, and now on steroids, I guess. The final point I wanted to make with regards to, just on the democracy point, just on to keep it on record, statistically, democracies have a better record in ending insurgents challenges to them. Even though authoritarians have a close record, authoritarian systems have a close record, but still in terms of how successful authoritarian or how successful insurgent organization ended in somehow a peaceful, non-violent transition, democracies have the lead in that. And out of the more than 648 armed groups that the MEPIT database has, we have about 43% that turned into unarmed politics. The very final point on is this a new pattern or an interruption of a pattern? Well, we're looking at actually a new pattern in many ways. New pattern in the rise of non-state armed actors and their military capacities, new pattern in the rise of the intra-state wars and lack of mechanism, non-violent mechanism to conflict resolve these structural, from my perspective, problems. And more importantly, more and more market for non-state actors who are loyalists to a state and non-state actors who are non-loyalist and independent in many ways. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Omar.